Hi guys, and welcome to my Amnesia, a Machine for Pigs review. Now, immediately after I finished the game, I gave a quick sort of 5-minute first impressions, or I don't know what you call them, first impressions, but my feeling about the game just as I had finished it. But in this video, I'm going to give you a more nuanced and more well-considered review of the game. I am going to try and treat the game as its own entity. I'm going to review it as a standalone game, although inevitably I will have to compare it to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. But I am going to try and keep the nostalgia goggles firmly in their box and really look at the game objectively. So I'm going to start with graphics, how the game looked. Now, this is actually not as important as a lot of other things in this type of game, but Amnesia looks pretty good. Everything looks appropriate. There are a few minor niggles though. For example, there is a kind of strange fog throughout the game. Sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's green. I am not 100% sure why the developers added that. Maybe they thought it added some sort of ambience. For me, it just made things a teeny bit less pleasant to look at, but not necessarily more scary, so I'm not sure how I feel about that. I can also tell you that the performance in places was a little odd. You felt like you were getting very low frame rate, even though tools such as Fraps would be reporting I'm getting hundreds of frames per second. There were the odd stutter problems as well, especially at the start. However, I did find a fix for that, and I released a video regarding that, the Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs stutter fix, and I believe now the developers have released a patch that fixes all such issues. Actually, the developers of this game have been very hands-on and very communicative with the community at large. They have been working with people from the very start of the game's release, and they were releasing patches pretty quickly, so major kudos to them because they are a fairly small team. So I would rate the graphics as good enough to get the job done, but with a few minor issues. The next thing would be sound. Now, sound is very important in this type of game, and A Machine for Pigs delivers, and then some. The sounds in this game are great. They're very atmospheric, they're ridiculously creepy, and they do help keep you in this constant state of nervousness. The music is brilliant, and by brilliant I mean horrible and disturbing. It really does fit the horror genre. There's some very disturbing opera music. There is a lot of music that involves children singing off-key, which always freaks me out. So this is an area that they had to deliver on to get the game to be scary, and they did deliver on. Although I have to say, I do miss The Dark Descent, the sound of the monster coming. That sound, the sound of his moan, and the music that came with it still sends me into fits of panic right now. Next up, storyline. Now, the storyline is pretty basic and very well done. It's a very typical horror story. It's very Lovecraftian. It has a lot of disturbing elements, a lot of tragedy, and quite a lot of fear. It's well delivered. It's perhaps a little cliche. However, cliches get to be cliches because they're used very often, and that's because they work. And this story does work. You pick up the pieces of the story as you go along. They get delivered to you at a reasonable state so that you can follow along with a slight edge of confusion, probably brought on by the fact that you're terrified half the time. But it will keep you engaged, it will keep you wanting to find out more, even though you probably already figured out what's coming. You just have to go on and find out for sure. Okay, let's talk about challenges. Now, the game has quite a few little tasks that you have to perform, little puzzles that you need to figure out. Well, not exactly puzzles. To be honest with you, the tasks don't require a huge amount of thought and consideration. And I don't mean that as an insult. This game is not supposed to be a puzzle game. It is not supposed to be some sort of abstract puzzle to be solved. It is a story to be experienced. And all the tasks that you do fit the game perfectly. You've got to open a gate and there's a mechanism that requires power. You have to find a fuse for the power source, plug it into the power source, flick the switch and the gate opens. There's nothing complicated about it, but it fits, which helps keep you immersed in the game and focused on the really important thing, which is being utterly terrified. These challenges are made even more immersive by the fact that the game mechanics are exceptionally simple, very fluid and pretty much instinctive once you get used to the hand and mouse movement. The fact that you open doors by just grabbing them and pulling them or pushing them, the fact that you do the same with drawers, you pick up objects by clicking, holding and moving. It feels very natural and you end up not thinking about it. After about 5 minutes you will literally do it as if it was second nature. So the game mechanics really do help keep the game flowing. And for me that is very important because, like the challenges, if you're focusing on the abstract, on game mechanics or on solving some weird puzzle that makes no sense, you're not focusing on being scared. And that is what this game is about. So, I mean, that is, I guess, the major criteria here. So, was the game scary? Simple answer, yes. It was very scary. It's as scary as you let it be, I think. I think the same is true of Dark Descent and probably is true of any horror game. If you let the game scare you, it will. Now, this is an area where you have to compare it to the Dark Descent. And I have to tell you now, it has a completely different type of scary to the Dark Descent. And I will say, in my opinion, it's not even close to as scary as the Dark Descent. The Dark Descent had me in a state of near catatonic fear the entire time. Well, not the entire time, but a lot of the time. My brain was just inventing ways I was going to be horribly killed every second. I was my own worst enemy. I was scaring myself, and that was the true genius of the Dark Descent. It made you terrify yourself with your own imagination. A Machine for Pigs has a different approach. It scares you itself. It has a lot of scripted scare moments, which, you could consider a little brutal, not quite as subtle, but they do work. They are very well done. And whilst you still have that same feeling of having no control over what is going on, for some reason, A Machine for Pigs never quite makes you feel as threatened as the Dark Descent. You don't really feel like you're being hunted, you feel like you're being herded somewhere, which is terrifying, but not in the same immediate way that it was terrifying in the Dark Descent. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that A Machine for Pigs is not the Dark Descent, and it doesn't seem to be trying to be the Dark Descent 2. It's trying to be its own game. And the reason I say that is the feeling I got from A Machine for Pigs was horror. Not fear, but horror. I wasn't scared for my own safety. I was scared about what I was going to discover. I was scared of what I was going to find out. I was scared of failing my children. I was scared of finding out what had happened to them. It was this constant state of horror, disgust, a feeling of being disturbed more than anything else. People who read a lot of Lovecraft will recognize that sensation, where you're not so much scared as just deeply horrified. And in this respect, this game is an epic achievement. It's, instead of mimicking the same type of fear, the same type of feelings you got in the Dark Descent, they're giving you a whole different horror experience. In the Dark Descent, you were constantly terrified that you were going to be viciously and brutally killed. In A Machine for Pigs, you almost wish you were. The moments when something jumped out on me and I had to run, screaming, were almost a relief because it took my mind off all the horror that was going on around me. And so whilst the inevitable comparisons between The Dark Descent are going to continue, I have to say, I think A Machine for Pigs was a great game. It delivered horror, it delivered fear, it was entertaining in a weird kind of way, and at the end I felt so emotionally drained, and yet I felt like I had achieved something. It is a game I will not forget in a hurry. So that really is it. That's the bulk of my review for this game. However, I have a few more things I would like to say about the game when comparing it to The Dark Descent. However, it will probably contain the odd spoiler. So if you've not played the game, or you've not played The Dark Descent, for example, you might want to stop here. I think both games are well worth playing and you should play them. However, I do have a few observations when comparing the two. The first observation really is I didn't like the lack of interaction with the world that A Machine for Pigs had. In The Dark Descent, you could pretty much poke, prod, move, and otherwise, manipulate everything in the game. Well, maybe not everything, but enough items that the world felt interactive. A Machine for Pigs just lacked that, and you could argue that it streamlined the process, and I'm a big fan of that normally, but it just didn't feel that way with this. It sort of felt like there was just less to do. And of course, you didn't have an inventory, and your lantern didn't have oil, and I thought that was something that was, well, I liked that in The Dark Descent. I liked having a lantern where you could only use it for a certain amount of time before it would go out, because it forced you to use the lantern sparingly. And that meant sometimes you were creeping around in the dark. And if the oil ran out, you were in an absolute panic. And doubly so because of the insanity mechanic in The Dark Descent, which I'll get to in a second. So, whilst I understand the need to streamline things, I wasn't a big fan of that. I think they should have left the idea of the lantern having a power source and the inventory in. Picking up things like hammers and chisels and using them to do certain things, I think it was a little... It made the puzzles that I liked, fun. However, that does actually bring up the next point, and that is the puzzles. Now, one of the accusations I have seen recently aimed at A Machine for Pigs was it dumbed down the game by making the puzzles stupid and dumb and easy. And whilst it is true that the puzzles were much simpler, I disagree with the idea that it dumbed the game down. I actually am not a huge fan of some of the puzzles in The Dark Descent, and it's because they were abstract. And by that I mean they didn't fit the game. Some of the puzzles seemed to have just been added for the sheer sake of it. For example, the drawbridge to the morgue always struck me as odd. Having a drawbridge where they didn't seem to serve a purpose, because anything coming out of the morgue could just drop off the ledge. It wasn't that high. And anything trying to get into the morgue just pulled the lever and the drawbridge dropped. I didn't see the point of the drawbridge. Apart from the fact that, of course, the mechanism was broken, and that was the point of the drawbridge. The drawbridge was there to force you to fix a mechanism for the drawbridge because the drawbridge mechanism was broken. It's kind of a circular reason for its own existence. It wasn't a security door, obviously. There were simpler ways of making security. If you want to stop things coming out of the morgue, it's a lot easier than that. Same if you want to stop things getting into the morgue. There are a lot easier ways of achieving that than this ridiculously over-complex machine. And what made it even worse was the way you fixed the machine was so unrealistic, so unimmersive that it made you forget you were playing a horror game for a while. Because it was an abstract puzzle. You had a bunch of sandbags on one side that had to be moved up and down to the same height of sandbags on the other side of a corridor, and some pipes that needed to be mirrored on one side of the... It was like playing a Reader's Digest puzzle book. It didn't feel like I was fixing a machine. Anyone with any mechanical knowledge at all would be looking at this thinking, this is ridiculous. You know, you don't fix your car by opening up the bonnet, looking at the engine and making sure everything is symmetrical. You don't start moving sandbags up and down to make it work. It was so obviously a puzzle aimed at the player. It was not a machine that needed to be fixed by Daniel. It was a puzzle that needed to be solved by the player, and I felt like I was in a reality TV show. And, you know, when I finished it, I got a prize and could move on to the next stage. And that is not a feeling I want when playing a horror game. I want to be immersed in the world. And indeed, those were the few moments when doing those type of puzzles where I really wasn't scared. I stopped being scared. In fact, I usually only started being scared just as I got to the completion of the puzzle, because I knew as soon as I completed the puzzle, that's where probably some scripted scare event would occur. And this was very immersion breaking. I'm a lot of people who watch my videos know I do not like mini games. I do not like things that look like a game within a game, and a lot of the Dark Descent puzzles felt like that. Now, I like puzzles. It's kind of don't mix your pleasures. And I think A Machine for Pigs was better because every puzzle I solved, every task I did felt real. I had to put some fuel into a truck to move the truck to get into a gate. And I did it in a way that would have made sense had I been there, rather than, you know, I didn't have to do some strange crossword puzzle to move the truck out of the way. And finally, I guess I'd like to talk about the insanity mechanic that the Dark Descent had. I really liked that. I liked the way the Dark Descent forced you into these horrible choices. You had to hide from the monster and you had to hide in the dark. But when you're in the dark, your insanity goes up. It was just, you were like, oh my God, am I going to be mad before the monster is gone? It was this horrible catch-22 situation where you just felt totally powerless. And I loved that. And the more insane you got and the darker it was, the more your vision would start to twist and the walls would come in and out. And you felt like you were truly going mad. I think that was a great mechanic. And I'm absolutely baffled as to why they removed it. But then I'm equally baffled by the way they changed the lantern. The idea that the lantern never ran out. All right. You've got batteries that last several hours, so fine, you've got a reason for it, I suppose. But then there should have been some reason not to have the lantern out. They should have had something that made you choose whether or not to have the lantern out. Whereas I found that in actual fact, I kept the lantern out the whole time because it just made life easier to see things. But also, it was a monster detector. It would flicker when something bad was about to happen, which was very useful. And seeing as there almost never seemed to be a case where I was hiding successfully from these creatures. Well, I think there was one case. Having the lantern out never made me feel vulnerable. Occasionally, you know, you'd see something, you'd put the lantern away and think, I hope it didn't see me. But then it would run past in a way that looked very scripted, and you kind of knew it wouldn't have mattered if you'd just waved the lantern at him. So honestly, I preferred the way I had to deal with light in the Dark Descent. But don't get me wrong, I mean, these are tiny things, details, and it's the inevitable result of having played both games. You're going to compare them, and had they not been both called Amnesia, I would have ranked them both as exceptionally good games, but different. Because they both share the Amnesia game, obviously you're going to do some comparison, and in some ways, A Machine of Pigs it missed the mark of the original game. Now, that was almost inevitable because the original game was quite brilliant. Apart from the odd, niggly complaint I had, like the abstract puzzles, the Dark Descent was absolutely amazing. And in many ways, I think a lot of people were hoping for the Dark Descent 2. The same damned game, maybe a slightly different story in a slightly different place, but pretty much the same damned game. Everything identical. And I think they could have done that, sold it, and people would have bought it. Honestly, not totally sure why they didn't. They could probably have released 5 of them, full games. Don't forget expansion packs, but just full games. The Dark Descent 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I would have bought them and played them. So, A Machine of Pigs, it's a new game. It's a new type of horror, and when considered by itself, it's exceptionally good. When compared to The Dark Descent, it's still good, it's just, it came second. It came second in that race. So that's it. That is my opinion, that is my review of Amnesia, A Machine of Pigs. I realise it has been somewhat long and babbly, and I do apologise if you were hoping for a short, sharp review. But welcome to my channel, because you must be pretty new. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible person, I know. Anyway, I hope the review was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys soon.